The world has a way of hiding knives behind smiles. What happens when the person you trust most, the one you call sister, transforms into the sharpest blade aimed at your heart? Imagine losing your mother in your teenage years, only to watch your best friend step into her place, not as a sister but as your stepmother. Imagine her twisting your father's love into suspicion, his pride into shame, until you, his precious daughter, are cast aside like a stranger in your own home. This is not just a tale of betrayal. It is the story of Naledi Maseko, the jewel of Cape Town's elite, and the painful fight she faced against the one person she thought would always stand by her side. So, grab a seat, clear your mind, and let us walk together through this unforgettable journey of love twisted into greed and friendship turned into bitter betrayal. Cape Town's wine country is a place of breathtaking beauty. Rolling vineyards stretch across green valleys guarded by mountains that rise like ancient kings. Tourists from all over the world fly in to taste the city's finest wines, to photograph its golden sunsets, and to breathe in the fragrance of lavender and oak. At the heart of this paradise stood the Maseko estate. With its grand Cape Dutch mansion, white-walled cellars, and acres of vines, it was not just a business. It was a legacy. Generations of Masekos had poured their sweat into the soil, but no one carried the name with as much dignity as Mr. Themba Maseko, Naledi's father. Respected in boardrooms, admired in the community, and loved by his workers, Mr. Maseko was a man whose handshake carried more weight than a lawyer's contract. Yet behind all the success and wealth, he was most proud of one thing: his daughter. Naledi had been born under the soft Cape moon, her cry filling the estate halls with joy. Her mother, Lindiwe, often said she was a child, touched by grace. And she grew to prove it true. By 16, Naledi was already the center of her father's world. Her late mother had passed after a sudden illness, leaving a silence in the mansion that even the laughter of visitors could not fill. Mr. Maseko vowed that day never to remarry. With tear-stained eyes at the graveside, he whispered, "From now on, all my love belongs to you, my daughter." While the children of other wealthy families flaunted arrogance, Naledi walked differently. Her father raised her on values of humility, discipline, and compassion. She was the kind of young woman who greeted the estate workers by name, who played with their children after school, who gave her pocket money to the kitchen staff's son so he could buy new shoes. At university, she carried herself with quiet grace. Professors praised her brilliance. Students admired her kindness. Suitors lined up with flowers, promises, and expensive gifts. But Naledi was not one to be swayed by empty glitter. She was, in every way, her father's pride and her late mother's reflection. The day fate brought Thandi Dlamini into Naledi's life was an ordinary one, the kind of day that gives no hint it will change everything. It was a humid afternoon in Cape Town. Naledi sat in the university library, bent over a heavy textbook on South African commercial law, when she heard a faint sound beside her, the thud of books scattering. She looked up to see a young woman crouched on the floor, scrambling to gather papers that had slipped from a torn folder. Without hesitation, Naledi knelt and helped scoop the sheets into a neat pile. "Here," she said softly, passing the last paper. The girl looked up, strands of braided hair falling across her face. Her eyes were bright, the kind that carried both fire and fragility. "Thank you," she said, her voice a mixture of embarrassment and relief. "I should really invest in a proper file before my entire life ends up on the floor." Naledi chuckled. "Or maybe just carry fewer books." That was the first time Naledi saw Thandi smile, wide, unguarded, and warm enough to melt the library's silence. "I'm Thandi," she said, extending a hand. "Naledi." Their palms met, and with that simple touch, a bond began. In the weeks that followed, Thandi and Naledi became inseparable. What started as shared study sessions grew into late-night conversations about dreams, fears, and the unfairness of the world. They laughed over instant noodles in the hostel, whispered secrets in lecture halls, and walked side by side across campus like sisters who had known each other all their lives. Where Naledi was gentle, thoughtful, and reserved, Thandi was bold, witty, and full of restless energy. She had a way of making strangers laugh within minutes, of filling any room with her presence. "I talk too much," she often said, rolling her eyes at herself. "And I talk too little," Naledi replied. "That's why we're perfect together." Their differences balanced them, like fire and water learning to dance. Soon, people began to call them the twins. Professors teased them about always sitting side by side. Friends joked that if you found one, the other was not far behind. Unlike Naledi, who had grown up surrounded by luxury and legacy, Thandi came from modest means. Her father was a retired high school teacher, stern but honorable. Her mother sold fabrics in a bustling township market, her laughter echoing above the haggling of buyers. Thandi often joked about envying Naledi's life. "Imagine living on a wine estate surrounded by beauty, wealth, and fine things," she said once, lying on Naledi's dorm bed with her legs in the air. "Meanwhile, I grew up surrounded by chalk dust and fabric scraps." Naledi smiled. "But you grew up surrounded by love. That's priceless." Thandi's eyes softened, though for a brief moment something unreadable flickered in them. It was gone too quickly for Naledi to notice. By their final year, their friendship had deepened into something rare. They studied for exams together, dreamed about traveling the world, and promised each other that nothing, no man, no money, no circumstance, would ever come between them. One night, as the city lights twinkled below Table Mountain, they sat on a rooftop sharing a cheap bottle of sparkling juice. "If we're not married by 30, Thandi declared with mock seriousness, "let's just live together forever and adopt a bunch of dogs." Naledi laughed so hard she nearly choked. "You'd get tired of me after 1 week." "Never," Thandi said firmly. "You're my sister. Blood couldn't make us closer." Naledi believed her. With all her heart, she believed her. But destiny is a patient hunter, and while Naledi laughed under the stars with her best friend, betrayal was already taking shape in the shadows of her future. The Maseko estate was beautiful, but beauty cannot fill silence. And as the years passed, silence grew heavier within its whitewashed walls. Every evening, after the vineyard workers had gone home and the sun dipped behind the mountains, Mr. Themba Maseko sat alone in the drawing room with nothing but the grandfather clock for company. His late wife's portrait hung above the fireplace, Lindiwe, her smile eternal, her eyes bright even in paint. He had promised her he would never remarry, and he had kept that vow for over a decade. But vows do not banish loneliness, and lately, loneliness had become his most faithful companion. One evening, as the fire crackled and shadows played across the ceiling, Mr. Maseko turned to his daughter. "Naledi," he said softly, "you'll soon marry and build your own home. What will become of me then? A man cannot live on memories alone." Naledi's heart clenched. She had grown so used to being the center of her father's life that the thought of another woman in the house felt like a betrayal of her late mother. She remembered the graveside vow. She remembered his words, "All my love will now belong to you." Tears welled in her eyes that night, though she hid them. The next day, Naledi poured her heart out to Thandi during one of their walks across campus. "He says he needs a companion," Naledi whispered, her voice trembling. "But I can't imagine another woman in my mother's place. It feels wrong." Thandi listened intently, her head tilted, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long silence, she spoke with a sly smile. "Why don't I marry him?" Naledi froze, staring at her. "What?" Thandi laughed lightly as though it were a joke, but her eyes glinted with something sharper. "Think about it," she said. "We're already sisters in every way that matters. Who else could care for him the way I would? If I marry him, you won't have to worry about some stranger stepping into your mother's shoes. It'll still be family, just closer." Naledi's mind swirled. The idea was wild, absurd even. Yet in her grief and confusion, it didn't sound entirely unreasonable. Thandi was her best friend, her second half. If anyone were to enter the family, perhaps it was better it be her. Naledi imagined her father smiling again, no longer weighed down by loneliness. She imagined herself gaining not just a best friend, but a sister in truth. Slowly, through tears, she nodded. Maybe that could work. And in that moment, without knowing it, Naledi opened the door to her own betrayal. The following week, Naledi gathered her courage and approached her father in his study. He was seated at his oak desk, glasses perched on his nose, reviewing vineyard accounts. "Daddy," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up immediately. "Yes, my star?" She hesitated, then blurted it out. If you must remarry, I know someone who cares for us. Someone I trust." His brow furrowed. "Who?" "Thandi," she said. "My friend." The silence that followed was suffocating. The old clock ticked louder, each second stretching like an eternity. "Thandi?" Mr. Maseko repeated slowly, as though tasting the name for the first time. Naledi nodded quickly. "Yes. She knows us. She's kind. She would protect you. And me." Mr. Maseko leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Naledi, good men are ruined by the wrong hands. I cannot pretend I don't see hunger when young people look at an old man's house." "She isn't like that," Naledi insisted, her voice trembling. "Daddy, this was my idea. She only mentioned it because she cares about us." For a long moment he studied her face. He saw not the child who once hid behind his legs, but a young woman desperate to help him. At last he sighed and turned to the window, watching the vineyard sway in the afternoon breeze. "One lunch," he said finally. "Invite her for one lunch, then we shall see." The following Sunday, Thandi arrived at the estate in a simple cream dress. She greeted the staff politely, even offering to help set the table, a gesture that shocked the chef into silence. When she met Mr. Maseko, she curtsied deeply. "Sir, thank you for welcoming me into your home," she said, her voice sweet. "I came only because your daughter invited me." The meal was carefully orchestrated. Thandi spoke modestly of her dreams to empower women, praised Naledi's kindness with anecdotes that made the housekeeper chuckle, and never once mentioned wealth. By the end of the lunch, even the stoic Mr. Maseko felt the edges of his suspicion soften. But as she rose to leave, he noticed something, a flicker in her eyes as they swept across the chandeliers, the antique vases, the silver frames. It lasted only a heartbeat, but he filed it away. For empires are not built by ignoring instincts. The wedding was everything Cape Town's high society expected. Guests in bright gale and tailored suits filled the grand hall of a luxury vineyard resort. Photographers jostled for the best angle. Newspapers whispered the headline before the vows were even spoken. Billionaire wine magnate marries daughter's best friend. Naledi, dressed in a gown of pale gold, stood beside Thandi, smiling for the cameras. She told herself she was doing something noble, something that would heal her father's loneliness. As they cut the cake and toasted to love, she whispered to her best friend, "We're truly sisters now." Thandi hugged her tightly, her perfume sweet, her smile glowing. "Forever," she murmured. But even as the word left her lips, her eyes slid past Naledi to the man whose empire she now had access to. Her new husband. At first, the changes were subtle. Naledi noticed Thandi no longer joined her in late-night talks. She no longer borrowed clothes or shared silly gossip. Instead, she moved about the estate with a new stiffness, as though she had become its queen overnight. Marriage changes people, Naledi told herself. She's just adjusting. But soon, the distance became impossible to ignore. Thandi began eating separately, dining with Mr. Maseko in the private wing of the mansion. She answered Naledi's calls with one-word replies. The friend who once giggled about shoes and dreams now wore diamond-studded blouses and spoke with cold authority. The staff noticed, too. They had once seen Naledi as the princess of the estate, the young madam they respected and adored. Now, under Thandi's watchful eyes, their loyalty wavered. The mask slipped further one afternoon when Naledi reached for a plate of rice in the kitchen. "Don't touch that," Thandi snapped sharply. Naledi blinked in surprise. "But I'm hungry." "That's for my husband," Thandi said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You're not a guest here, Naledi, and you're certainly not the princess you think you are. This is my house now." Her words stung like fire. Naledi stood frozen, the staff glancing at each other nervously, unsure whether to intervene. For the first time, she felt like a stranger in her own home. Worse still, Thandi's influence over Mr. Maseko grew by the day. She cooked his favorite meals, massaged his shoulders after long hours, and whispered into his ear in the quiet of night. Slowly, his once unwavering trust in Naledi began to waver. "Daddy, you know me," Naledi pleaded one evening after he accused her of neglecting her studies. "I would never disappoint you." But his eyes were clouded. "Your stepmother tells me otherwise, and the evidence is there, Naledi." Step-mother. The word struck like a blade. Thandi's victory was nearly complete, or so it seemed. Thandi's cruelty escalated. She ordered Naledi to use the back staircase instead of the grand one. She locked the fridge at night, forcing her to sneak into the kitchen like a thief for scraps. One morning, with visitors arriving for a wine-tasting event, Thandi gave her the cruelest order yet. "Go to the garden," she said sweetly. "On your knees. Scrub the stone path until it shines." Naledi stared at her in disbelief. "But do it," Thandi interrupted, her tone sharp as glass. "Guests mustn't see dirt. Or would you rather they see the daughter of Mr. Maseko as lazy?" So Naledi bent low in the soil, her hands raw against the stones, while the guests arrived in silk dresses and polished shoes. From the corner of her eye, she saw Thandi standing at the balcony, watching with a satisfied smile. "Who would believe," Thandi said loudly enough for the staff to hear, "that the daughter of a great estate owner would end up scrubbing floors? The world bows to power, Naledi, not pity." What Thandi did not know was that Mr. Maseko had seen more than she imagined. Though he seemed silent, though he seemed conquered, his sharp instincts had not abandoned him. In the corners of the mansion, discreet cameras blinked quietly, capturing every whisper, every cruel act. Mr. Maseko said nothing. Not yet, but he was watching. And though Thandi believed she was untouchable, the very walls of the estate were collecting the evidence of her downfall. The winter rains came to Cape Town that year, heavy and relentless. They lashed against the estate windows, turned the vineyards into rivers of mud, and filled the mansion with a damp chill. But inside, a storm far darker raged. Naledi's world had shrunk to silence and shame. Once adored by staff and cherished by her father, she now wandered the corridors like a shadow. Her meals were rationed, her presence dismissed. Even the workers avoided her eyes, fearful of Thandi's wrath. Every night she prayed to her late mother's memory, whispering to the darkness, "Please, Mama, please don't let him forget who I am." One stormy evening, unable to sleep, Naledi drifted past her father's study. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, she heard the low murmur of voices. She froze, her heart thudding, and leaned closer. It was Thandi and her mother. "You've entered his house now," the older woman whispered fiercely. "Do not waste time on friendship. Love will not feed you. What matters is control. The estate must fall into your hands completely." "Yes, Mama," Thandi replied. Her voice was colder than Naledi had ever heard it. "I understand. There is a herbalist in Gugulethu," her mother continued. "He will give you charms to bind Mr. Maseko's heart to yours and turn him against that girl. If the daughter stands in your way, she must fall." Naledi gasped silently, her whole body trembling. She wanted to burst in, to scream the truth into her father's ears, but fear chained her tongue. She fled back to her room, tears blurring her vision. From that day, Mr. Maseko's health began to falter. He coughed more often, his hands trembled, and a strange drowsiness overtook him at odd hours. Naledi suspected the worst, but whenever she tried to speak, Thandi intercepted her. "Don't burden him," Thandi hissed once, shoving Naledi back as she tried to enter his study. "You'll only upset him further." Naledi wept that night, alone on her balcony, the rain soaking her gown. The friend she had once trusted more than anyone had become her tormentor, her betrayer. The cruelty reached its peak during the annual harvest festival, when dignitaries, investors, and journalists gathered at the estate. Traditionally, Naledi had always hosted with her father, smiling, greeting guests, and representing the family legacy. This year, Thandi took her place. She wore a gown of emerald silk, diamonds glittering at her throat, and spoke to the guests as though she had been born into the legacy. Naledi, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Thandi had ordered her to the cellars that morning. "Clean the barrels," she said with a smirk. "Make yourself useful for once. Leave the entertaining to those who know how." So while music and laughter floated across the estate lawns, Naledi knelt in the cold, damp cellars, scrubbing until her hands bled. She thought of her mother. She thought of the promise she and Thandi had once made under the Cape Town stars. "Nothing will ever come between us." The bitterness of betrayal was sharper than any knife. Upstairs, Mr. Maseko smiled for the cameras, shook hands with investors, and let Thandi bask in the glow of her false victory. But behind his spectacles, his sharp eyes missed nothing. He had seen his daughter's humiliation. He had heard the cruel words, and the cameras he had ordered installed weeks ago had shown him the truth, the plotting, the poisons, the betrayals whispered in the dead of night. For now, he remained silent. For now, he played the weak old man under his wife's control. But the time was coming when silence would end. And when it did, Thandi's empire of lies would crumble in a single blow. The morning after the harvest festival dawned bright and clear, the vineyards glistening under the soft Cape sun. To anyone looking from the outside, the Maseko estate seemed peaceful, prosperous even. But inside the mansion, a reckoning was brewing. Mr. Maseko had summoned his lawyer, his board members, and a few trusted friends to the study. Naledi, pale from sleepless nights, sat silently in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't know why her father had called her there, but she prayed with every fiber of her being, that he had finally seen the truth. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. Thandi swept in like a queen, dressed in silk the color of midnight. At her side was her mother, eyes sharp and calculating. "Good morning, everyone," Thandi said, her voice honeyed. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Maseko rose slowly from behind his desk. He looked frailer than usual, his movements deliberate, but his eyes were steady as steel. "Yes," he said calmly. "Let us begin." He gestured toward the wall. At his signal, his head of security pressed a button. Screens flickered to life, hidden camera footage projected for all to see. Gasps filled the room. On the screen, Thandi and her mother appeared, sitting in the study late at night. Their voices were clear. "The estate must fall into your hands completely. There is a herbalist, he will give you charms to bind him and destroy the girl." Thandi's face drained of color. That's not what it looks like," she stammered. But more footage followed. Thandi slipping powders into Mr. Maseko's tea. Thandi mocking Naledi in the garden. Thandi ordering her to scrub the path while guests arrived. Every word, every act, captured by the unblinking eyes of the estate's cameras. Naledi covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Her father had seen. He had known. "You thought I was blind," Mr. Maseko said, his voice steady, cutting through the room like a blade. "But I built my empire on caution. I saw the hunger in your eyes the first day you stepped into my home, and I let you play your game, because I wanted the truth to reveal itself." Thandi fell to her knees, clutching at his robe. "Please, Baba." "Do not call me that," he thundered. "You are no daughter, no wife. You are a viper I allowed too close. And like every viper, your poison is your undoing." Her mother tried to interject, but the lawyer stood and handed Mr. Maseko a stack of documents. With firm hands, he signed the papers. Effective immediately, he declared, Thandi Dlamini is stripped of all marital rights, all claims to my estate, and all access to my business. Security will escort you out, and should you resist, he paused, his gaze sharp. The authorities are already waiting. Thandi screamed, her voice breaking, clawing at the floor as they dragged her to her feet. Her mother cursed loudly, but her words were powerless against the iron weight of truth. The door slammed behind them, their protests echoing into nothingness. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then Mr. Maseko turned to his daughter. Naledi, he said softly, his voice breaking. My star, forgive me. Naledi rushed into his arms, sobbing into his chest. You saw, you knew. I never stopped believing in you, he whispered, holding her tightly. Even when my heart was clouded, I trusted my instincts, and they led me back to the truth. To you. The board members nodded in solemn agreement. The lawyer, clearing his throat, said, Sir, shall we amend the will? Mr. Maseko looked at Naledi with eyes full of love. Everything I have belongs to my daughter. She is my true legacy. Naledi wept harder, not for the wealth, but for the restoration of trust, for the father who had returned to her. In the months that followed, the estate flourished again. With Thandi gone, the air was lighter, the halls warmer. The workers greeted Naledi with renewed respect, their loyalty deeper than ever. Mr. Maseko's health improved, freed from the poisons that had weakened him, and Naledi, though scarred by betrayal, grew stronger. Sometimes, late at night, she would stand on the balcony, looking up at the stars, remembering the promises she and Thandi once made. A bitter smile would touch her lips. Not all sisters are born of blood, and not all friendships are meant to last. But betrayal, no matter how sharp, cannot destroy truth. And in the end, truth always finds a path.
Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe.